For 8 years, the dust of the Nikon ore mine held its secrets, and Quentin was the only one who had escaped its grasp. Found wandering the trailhead with a head injury and no memory of the field trip, he was labeled the lone survivor of a tragic cave-in that claimed his classmates and teacher. Now a geologist himself, he's dedicated his life to mine safety, driven by a grief he can't fully recall, until a retired rescuer mails him a dusty geology textbook found near the collapse site, his own book, with a quartz crystal marking a map he doesn't remember seeing. It's strange how a memory you never knew you lost can still haunt you. Before you dive into Quentin's search for the truth, take a moment to subscribe and join our community of story lovers who believe that the most compelling mysteries are the ones hidden in plain sight. Quentin's apartment was less of a home and more of a laboratory for controlling chaos. Every book on his shelf was perfectly aligned, every geological sample was labeled and categorized, and the blueprints for mine bracings and support structures on his walls served as his version of art. It was a life built on prediction and prevention, a direct response to the one day in his life that had been neither. He lived with the ghosts of 11 classmates and one teacher, but they were shapeless, nameless phantoms. The doctors called it dissociative amnesia, a merciful wall his 17-year-old brain had built to protect him from the horror of the Nikon ore mine collapse. But the mercy felt like a curse. He couldn't mourn people he couldn't remember. He only felt a constant, low hum of absence, the feeling that a huge piece of his own soul had been carved out and left behind in that dark, silent mountain. His career was his penance. He designed safety protocols for mining companies, obsessing over soil composition reports and seismic activity charts. He was the man who ensured that no other group of kids would ever walk into a mountain and not walk out. It was a life of quiet, lonely purpose, until the package arrived. It was a simple brown cardboard box with a handwritten return address for an A. Henderson in a neighboring state. He didn't recognize the name. Inside, nestled in bubble wrap, was a book. It was a standard high school textbook, an introduction to practical geology. Its cover was faded and dirt-stained, its corners soft and frayed from use. He knew it instantly. It was his. His name, Quentin Hale, was written on the inside cover in his own teenage scrawl. His breath caught in his throat. His hands began to tremble as he traced the familiar letters. The book fell open to the middle, held there by a piece of milky quartz, its point resting on a diagram of the western Rocky Mountain Range. It wasn't just any rock. It was a specific type he remembered, or felt he should remember, from that day. A fragment of a memory, sharp and painful, pierced the fog in his mind. The cool, smooth feel of the crystal in his hand, the enthusiastic voice of his teacher, Mr. Albright, explaining its formation. He slammed the book shut, his heart hammering against his ribs. The phantom limb of his past was suddenly aching with an excruciating, tangible pain. After his breathing returned to normal, he cautiously opened it again. The crystal was marking a map of the national forest where the Nikon mine was located, but something was wrong. There was a faint, hand-drawn line in pencil leading away from the officially marked mine trail and into a region labeled on the map as unstable and unsurveyed. Beside the line were annotations, little notes about rock density and potential fissures. The handwriting wasn't his. It was the neat, precise script of Mr. Albright. Quentin stumbled back from his coffee table, the carefully constructed order of his life shattering like glass. For 8 years, the story had been simple, a tragic, unavoidable accident. A geological survey after the collapse confirmed a minor, localized tremor had likely caused the old mine's entrance to give way. It was an act of nature. But this map, this crystal, this secret trail, this wasn't an act of nature. This was a plan. His new goal settled over him with the weight of a burial shroud. He had to know what that plan was. He had to know what really happened in that mine. The hope wasn't for finding survivors. He knew that was impossible, but for finding the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. His first step was to find A. Henderson. A quick search of the name combined with the town on the return address brought him to an online obituary for Arthur Henderson, a retired search and rescue volunteer who had passed away 3 months ago. The obituary mentioned he was survived by his wife. Quentin found her number and dialed, his stomach churning with a mixture of dread and anticipation. A woman's gentle, elderly voice answered. He explained who he was, the words feeling foreign and heavy in his mouth. "My husband was on the initial response team for the Nikon collapse," she said, her voice filled with a distant sadness. "He never truly got over that one. So many kids." She paused. "He found that book a few years after the accident, wedged in the rocks near an old, sealed-off ventilation shaft, a good half-mile from the main entrance where they were searching. He reported it, but the sheriff at the time said it didn't change anything. The case was closed." "Why did he keep it all these years?" Quentin asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Guilt," she replied simply. "He always felt they'd missed something. He said the location of that book never made sense. Before he got sick, he made me promise I'd send it to you. He said you deserved to have all the pieces, even if they didn't fit the puzzle." All the pieces. The words echoed in his head as he hung up. The book wasn't found at the site of the collapse. It was found near a sealed ventilation shaft, far from where the field trip was supposed to be. He pulled out the official blueprints of the Nikon ore mine, the ones he'd studied countless times, and laid them next to the textbook's hand-drawn map. They didn't match. Mr. Albright's pencil line pointed to a section of the mountain that, according to the official survey, was solid rock. There was no mine there. Driven by a new frantic energy, Quentin packed a bag and started the 4-hour drive to Silver Creek, the small, forgotten town that rested in the shadow of the mountain that had stolen his past. The town was much as he vaguely remembered it, a single main street with buildings that sagged with the weight of time and memory. He found the old sheriff, a man named Jedediah, running a small diner. Jedediah's face was a road map of wrinkles, and his eyes held the weary look of a man who'd seen too much. He recognized Quentin's name immediately. "The Hale boy," he said, pouring him a cup of coffee. "I was there when they found you. Dazed, confused, couldn't even remember your own name for a while." Quentin showed him the book, the map. "This was found near the old northern vent shaft. Did your team search up there?" The old sheriff shook his head slowly. "No need. The collapse was at the main entrance. The geological report was clear. A minor tremor sealed it tight as a drum. We focused all our efforts there." He looked at the map in the book, his brow furrowed. Albright was a good man, a great teacher. He loved those mountains. He wouldn't have taken those kids into an unsurveyed area. It was just a terrible, tragic accident. Jedediah's certainty was the same certainty that had defined the narrative for 8 years. It was the story everyone had agreed upon because the alternative was too painful to consider. But Quentin now had proof that the story was a lie. He spent the next day at the county records office, a dusty basement filled with the smell of aging paper. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he started with anything related to the Nikon mine or Mr. Albright. He searched property deeds, mining claims, and geological survey requests. For hours, he found nothing. Then, buried deep in a box of miscellaneous survey applications from a decade ago, he found it. A request for a private geological survey commissioned not by a company, but by a single individual, Mr. Peter Albright. The survey wasn't for the known Nikon mine, but for the exact parcel of unstable and unsurveyed land marked on his textbook map. With trembling hands, Quentin pulled out the attached survey results. The report was filled with technical jargon, but the summary on the final page was crystal clear. It detailed the discovery of an incredibly rich, previously unknown seam of high-purity quartz. The estimated value was in the millions. The date on the report was 6 months before the field trip. Mr. Albright hadn't been leading a field trip. He had been leading his students to a secret, multi-million-dollar treasure hoard. The beloved teacher, the tragic victim, was a liar. And Quentin suspected he was something far worse. The field trip wasn't for education, it was cover. The question was, cover for what? And why had it ended with 11 students and 1 teacher buried under a mountain of rock and lies? Convincing the new sheriff of Silver Creek, a pragmatic and skeptical woman named Deputy Morris, was harder than finding the evidence itself. She listened patiently in her small, tidy office as Quentin laid out his story, the book, the map, the private survey. "Mr. Hale," she said, her tone professional but firm, What you have is a collection of old papers and a theory. The official cause of death for those 12 people is a mine collapse. The case is closed. Reopening it, let alone blasting open a sealed mine based on a 25-year-old high school textbook, requires more than a hunch. This is more than a hunch, Quentin insisted, his voice rising with an urgency that surprised even himself. My teacher secretly surveyed that land. He knew about a multi-million-dollar quartz vein. He made a map to it in my textbook and then led my class there under the guise of a field trip. This was planned. Something went wrong, and it wasn't a natural disaster. He leaned forward, his hands flat on her desk. For 8 years, I've had a hole in my memory. Now I know that hole is filled with a lie. I am asking you to help me find the truth. The families of those other kids deserve it. Morris studied him for a long moment, her gaze unwavering. She saw the haunted look in his eyes, the obsessive determination that had reshaped his entire life. Maybe it was the sheer conviction in his voice, or maybe it was the nagging detail that Arthur Henderson had reported the book years ago and been dismissed. Finally, she sighed. Okay, Hale, I can't authorize a full-scale excavation, but I can approve a limited exploratory mission. A small team, geologists and a structural engineer. You can lead them to the spot on your map. We'll use ground-penetrating radar. If it shows a void or anything unnatural, we'll talk about the next steps. But if it shows solid rock, you go home. And this case stays closed. Deal? Deal, Quentin said, a wave of relief washing over him. It was more than he had hoped for. 3 days later, Quentin stood at the base of the mountain, the morning air crisp and cold. With him were 2 geologists from the State Department and a grizzled mining engineer named Gus. Deputy Morris was there too, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. They used the map from the textbook to navigate, leaving the familiar trail and pushing through dense undergrowth. After an hour of hard hiking, they arrived at the coordinates Mr. Albright had secretly surveyed. To the naked eye, it was nothing more than a sheer rock face, covered in moss and hardy shrubs. Looks like solid mountain to me, kid, Gus grunted, chewing on a toothpick. Set up the GPR, Morris ordered. For the next hour, the geologists methodically scanned the rock face with the radar equipment. Quentin watched the screen over their shoulders, his heart pounding with every pass. At first, the readings showed exactly what Gus had predicted. Feet of solid granite. Quentin's hope began to fade. Maybe Morris was right. Maybe it was all just a wild theory. Then one of the geologists stopped. Wait a minute, I've got an anomaly. He pointed to a section of the screen where the uniform density pattern was broken. Right here, about 15 feet in. There's a void, rectangular. It's not natural. It looks like a tunnel. Quentin felt a jolt, a mixture of vindication and pure terror. He was right. Morris walked over, her skepticism finally cracking. How do we get in? Gus examined the rock face, running his calloused hands over its surface. This whole section feels different, he muttered. It's not native rock. It's shotcrete, colored to look like the mountain. A false wall. He pointed to a nearly invisible seam hidden by a thicket of bushes. Someone didn't want this found. They had the authorization they needed. The next day, Gus's team set small, precise charges along the seam. The explosion was a dull thud rather than a sharp crack, and when the dust settled, there was a dark, gaping hole in the side of the mountain. The air that drifted out was cold and stale, carrying the scent of deep earth and decay. Quentin, equipped with a helmet and a high-powered headlamp, was the first one to step inside. The tunnel was man-made, crudely carved, but stable. It descended steeply into the darkness. Morris and the others followed, their headlamps cutting sharp beams through the oppressive black. After about 100 yards, the tunnel opened into a large chamber, and it was there that Quentin's fractured past came rushing back in a horrifying, complete picture. The chamber was a makeshift mine. Mining tools, picks, shovels, and drills were scattered about. Sacks of high-grade quartz, the same milky white as the crystal from his book, were stacked against one wall, and huddled together in the center of the cavern were the skeletons of his classmates. He saw them not as bones, but as they were. Delia, with her bright laugh. Marco, who was always sketching in a notebook. All of them, frozen in time. The memories flooded back, Mr. Albright leading them into his secret extension of the mine, the excitement turning to confusion as he revealed his operation and told them they were going to be his partners. He remembered the arguments, the fear, the realization that their teacher was unhinged. He wasn't going to let them leave. And then, the sound. A deep, groaning rumble from the direction of the tunnel. A rock fall. Albright had gone to check on it, shouting that he'd be right back. He never returned. "Over here," Morris called from the far side of the chamber. Separated from the students, crushed beneath a massive boulder near another stack of quartz sacks, was a 12th skeleton. Mr. Albright. He hadn't trapped them and left. He'd been trapped with them, a victim of a secondary collapse triggered by his own reckless digging. He had been so focused on his greed that he had ignored the mountain's warnings, sealing his own tomb. In the silent, dusty cavern surrounded by the ghosts of his friends, Quentin finally understood. It wasn't just a betrayal. It was a tragedy born from a single man's desperate greed. The truth was uglier and sadder than any theory he could have imagined. The recovery process was slow and somber. The story of Mr. Albright's secret mine and his ultimate betrayal sent shockwaves through Silver Creek and beyond. For the families of the other 11 students, the discovery brought a painful, long-delayed closure. They could finally bring their children home. For Quentin, the truth was a key, unlocking the prison of his amnesia. The nightmares didn't stop, but now they had faces and names. The grief was no longer a shapeless void, but a heavy, real weight he could learn to carry. A month later, a new memorial was erected at the trailhead of the Nikon ore mine. It wasn't a stone for victims of a tragic accident, but a monument to 11 bright lives cut short by a teacher's greed. Quentin stood before it with the other families, a quiet solidarity in their shared loss. He read each name aloud, his voice steady. When he was done, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the smooth, milky quartz crystal from his textbook. He placed it gently at the base of the monument, a final piece of a puzzle that was finally complete. He had spent 8 years running from a past he couldn't remember. Now he could finally stand still, look it in the eye, and begin to heal. This story brings up a difficult question. Is it better to live with the comfort of a simple, tragic story, or to uncover a complicated and painful truth years later? Let us know what you think in the comments below. If you found yourself captivated by Quentin's journey for answers, make sure you hit that like button and consider subscribing. We're always digging up stories where the truth is stranger and more compelling than fiction. Thanks for listening.